Sionagad, Brian Barodalta, Talik Janel, Tosco Sud, Yawadatiad, Utan Jindelt Klas, Dagilastane, Jijalagi. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm 26 years old. I'm from Talco, Oklahoma, and I work at Northeastern State University, and I'm Cherokee. It's my pleasure today to welcome you all to the 48th Annual Symposium on the American Indian. This session is titled Storytelling Through Fire, the Reclamation and Socio-Ecological Importance of Indigenous Cultural Fire, with Melinda M. Adams and Day San Carlos Apache, the University of South California, Davis. As you probably know, the session is one of many that are included in this year's virtual agenda. Please do take time to visit our website at nsuk.edu/symposium for more details regarding the agenda. All sessions will be recorded and made available in the weeks to come. It's my pleasure to introduce Melinda M. Adams. She's an Indigenous scholar activist, multidisciplinary researcher, community leader, educator, and environmental stewardship advocate. She belongs to the Day San Carlos Apache tribe and grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She is a doctoral student in the Department of Native American Studies and the Environmental Policy and Management Department at the University of California, Davis, which is on unceded territory of the Patwin peoples. Melinda's heart work focuses on the reclamation of Indigenous land stewardship practices in California, specifically cultural fire, at the intersections of ecology/environmental science, environmental policy, and is grounded in Indigenous pedagogy and methodologies. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Science from Haskell Indian Nations University and her Master's of Science in Ecology from Purdue University. Everyone, let me welcome you and introduce you to Melinda M. Adams.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate how you took the time to learn the names of the peoples that I acknowledge in my introduction and the nations that I come from. So thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm so excited to be a part of this conference and coming off an amazing keynote that we just received over the lunch hour, and then Dr. Adrienne Keene's keynote from yesterday. Those are pretty powerful sessions, and for colleagues that are in between, I think the Center for Tribal Studies and NSUOK for allowing me time and space to share my work. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. So yes, I'm a doctoral student at the Department of Native American Studies at UC Davis. And so I'm situated about 15 miles west of Sacramento and about 40 miles east of San Francisco. So California is divided in Northern and Southern California. I learned that as a student going to school out here, and I'm in Northern California. And the topic that I'll be discussing today is my work with cultural fire, and I'll unpack and define what that is, and more so our reclamation versus revitalization, our reclamation activities in reclaiming how we go about connecting ourselves with fire and bringing fire back to the ground. So Dr. Adrienne Keene gave an amazing keynote address, and one of the things that she discussed was land acknowledgement, and it's been refreshing to see land acknowledgements be written and recited during different events on university campuses. But we're in the conversation right now with moving beyond land acknowledgement. And so the way that I and colleagues here at UC Davis have addressed land acknowledgements are, they're a starting point, right? And so on the screen, I have for you the land acknowledgement that we use and that we've consulted and collaborated with our Patwin Southern Wintun elders here, because UC Davis is on unceded territory of Patwin Southern Wintun peoples. So just that process in itself is the beginning of recognizing everybody's history, the land situated on. And so the way that I think about it is it's a noun, right? It's a thing, it's something that's done, and it's acknowledging our peoples, right? And so this is the land acknowledgement for the land that I'm currently on, And yeah, so this is where I'm at. And Dr. Keene gave some really great and insightful thoughts on moving beyond that, right? The verbiage of land acknowledgements. And so the work that we do here at UC Davis, we're all about accountability, like how is the university accountable to its Native and Indigenous students that are enrolled and those that are future students matriculating into the university. And so I think of a land acknowledgement as a noun, but moving to a land acknowledgement being a verb, right? Action behind it. And so some of the things that I've come up with and my colleagues have come up with at universities and moving beyond it is recognizing that the institution has disenfranchised Native peoples and people of colors historically and continues to do so presently, right? These weren't past atrocities that happened. They're living experiences that keep our people from attending and thriving in a university, and our experiences to carry as we progress in the university system. So recognizing that. Acknowledge that the institution is on stolen land and that Native peoples are very much present on campus and even in your classrooms. So the spaces that I occupy are in Native American studies, and these kind of go without saying, but I also occupy spaces in environmental sciences where they don't necessarily have conversations about whose unceded territory you're on, conducting your research in or working for. And so it's important that I hold those conversations in that space to insert Native people's presence, not just that we were here prior to colonization, but that we're still here. And more importantly, we still have those sets of lived experiences and knowledges connected to our lands and our waterways. So occupying that space in sciences and moving that conversation forward. Actively seek collaboration, consultation, and consent on projects involving potential projects involving Native peoples. This is also an important aspect of recognizing Native peoples. I learned that our university, we don't have a collective hub of who's doing research with Indigenous peoples in California in particular, what the subject area is or the students that they're working with. And so that could bode incredibly well for recruiting and retaining Native students on college campus and universities. And so one of the projects that we're working on at UC Davis is to find out who's working with tribal nations and what those projects look like, and if they have collaboration and consultation with those nations, which in our opinion is the only way to be engaging with Indigenous peoples of whose lands that the university belongs to. And then lastly, actively seek ways to support Native students, undergraduate and graduates, centering and uplifting our worldviews and our knowledge systems. So this is, of course, important in university spaces in order to find a sense of belonging for our Native students. But what resources are you allocating to Native students? So we're pushing in California, for example, for a tuition waiver for our California Indian identified students. Then it gets complicated when we talk about federally recognized versus unrecognized tribes. So as a starting point, that's the conversation that we're holding with university administrators and tuition waivers in act of retributions or kind of tied to the concept of land back, giving things back. So these are some of just the verbiages or movements beyond land acknowledgement that we're working on at UC Davis, and that I can see from the periphery, different conversations that are happening across what we know as the United States. So I really wanted to give a nod to Professor Keynes, and I like to open presentations like this because most of the time I'm outside of Native American studies, sharing these knowledges of cultural fire, but there'd be no cultural fire without Indigenous peoples and with that inherent knowledge that we have that's place-based specific. And so I think it's an important intervention and interjection of scientific work and land stewardship work to always come back and acknowledge Indigenous peoples, and to start by acknowledging and honoring Indigenous peoples. So my introduction gave my background, and one of the reasons why I was very interested and attracted to presenting at this conference is that I'm an alumni of Haskell Indian Nations University, which is a stone's throw away from Tahlequah. Just a fun fact, I actually grew up playing basketball, and I played basketball for Haskell, and we traveled quite a bit to Oklahoma during our road trips. And most of the students that we get that come to the tribal college there in Lawrence, Kansas, they come from Oklahoma. They're members of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw nations. And so it was nice to use the virtual space to be able to reconnect to some roots I have in the Midwest, but also to, maybe run into people that are affiliated with the tribal college at Haskell. So I came full circle, right? I was a student at Haskell Indian Nations University. I'm a proud tribal college graduate, and I actually returned to Haskell as an instructor for about 5 years in the environmental science department. And one of the things that I loved teaching about was the cultural significance of plants, returning languages to plant names, finding out their original, where they used to grow and how we can restore them. So that's a picture of me teaching my plant ecology class at Haskell Indian Nations University. And the bottom picture, is part of the class that I'll be sharing a little bit about today. It's called Keepers of the Flame, Indigenous Cultural Fire in California. And with that, I instruct students on how to conduct prescribed burns using traditional ecological knowledge that's shared amongst and within our cultural practitioner networking group in California. And so I love to teach. It's what my life's calling has been, and it's allowed me to move around throughout what we call the United States in different opportunities to work with, by, and for Native and Indigenous students. So the topic that brings us all here today is California wildfire. Not quite as prevalent in Oklahoma with the amount of wildfires that you all are experiencing, but in the different states that I give these talks to, one of the conversations that's always held is it's a problem in California, but because of the adjacency and the nearbyness of other states and surrounding, territories, we're all feeling the effects of California wildfire and wildfire worldwide. And if we're looking at the effects of climate change, those wildfires are going to get more catastrophic. They're going to get worse if we don't reckon with climate change solutions. And so it's a conversation to have in different states in order to reckon with the problems that we're experiencing, mainly in California and on the West Coast, but that everybody else feels either through air quality problems or through debris that blows into other states and boundaries. So this is a problem. California, we experienced another record-breaking year. So we lost 4 million acres to wildfire this season. And it's interesting to think about how we're problem solving wildfire here. And I don't like to use the word manage, right, or own. Those are words that we kind of try to stay away from because Indigenous peoples own all lands, right? We're situated on all lands. But if we're looking at metrics and how we are allocating resources to put more fire to the ground or to deal with wildfire, forests make up 33 million acres of the 104 acres of landmass in our state. And if we're looking at the agencies who allow burn permits or organize, prescribed, or control burns, the federal government, don't want to use the word manage, but they are in charge of, let's say that, for 57% of this acreage. Private landowners own 40% of the lands, and the state controls 3%. And so as a lens, we're looking at fire policy through federal agencies, through private landowners, and through the state. And so those are all regulatory frameworks that cultural practitioners and folks that want to get more prescribed fire on the ground must navigate and must adhere to the written policies that are in existence currently. The scale and complexity of forested landscapes is significant. And if we're looking at environmental history, most of California forested areas, and I would argue many of the plants and vegetations that are situated throughout what we call the United States, they're fire dependent. So they relied on fire for germination, for clearing out of overbrush, and for competitive strategies against invasive species. Indigenous peoples have always known this and have used those sets of knowledges to place fire on the ground in order to stimulate the growth of species that we needed for food, fibers, and medicines. So we know that plants are fire dependent, not just in California, but all across the US. We've known that for millennia now, which coincides with burn policies. And I'll get into that in the next slide, of the 1800s, that the whole message was no burn, or for forest burns were bad. So that's another tier that we're grappling with and trying to get more fires, prescribed fires, cultural fires back onto the ground to combat against these large scale catastrophic wildfires. So if you pair the effects of catastrophic wildfire that we're experiencing now here in California, and we're actually developing a wildfire season. So we know there's going to be burns over the summer and into the fall. The scale and complexity again is amplifying, right? They're getting bigger, they're getting more devastating, more lives are lost. And so California is in a position where we must troubleshoot at an increased rate. Hence, looking at cultural fire as an optimal solution to not only put more fires to the ground to help push back against those catastrophic wildfires, but also coupled with that is returning lands and land stewardship roles to Indigenous peoples in California. So I mentioned before that no burn policies didn't just remove fire from the land, they removed Indigenous peoples from the land too. So fire policies in the 1800s and 1900s coincided with Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act, right, which stole land from Indigenous peoples and auctioned off to white settlers. So the post-gold rush specific history in California was coupled with clear cutting. So they started to look at timber and trees as a good, right, a service and an economy-based product. So this destroyed California old growth, and then furthering that with no burn policies enacted by the forestry department, it's led to devastating ecological scenarios. The 19th century federal policies are directly, I think I said this about 3 times, so sorry. So removing Indigenous peoples from those lands removed that land-based knowledge and water-based knowledge that was tied to those lands, because we sustained ourselves, they sustained themselves for millennia prior to colonization. And so removing that history and removing those tides, those lessons of land from those spaces has also led to an ecological devastation here in California. So in being hopeful or moving forward, right, we're confident that tribal TEK may be able to, traditional ecological knowledge may be able to describe how climate and weather influence fire behavior from yearly to decadal, with generalized understandings of century scale climate and fire regime changes. So our peoples were incredibly observant, and we have these stories and lived experiences of not only surviving wildfire, because if we're looking at environmental history throughout, we've survived these changes in ecological systems, and we've survived these changes in the presence of wildfire. So we have those lived experiences within our Native communities. In addition, we've seen the changes in shifting environments with results of climate change. We've seen this over time. And so those are incredibly knowledgeable sets of information that Indigenous peoples have and hold and share right through our different community experiences. And so my work is situated with cultural fire, but also the the cultural meaning behind how we pass those knowledges and sets of systems. So that includes storytelling, right? Storytelling through fire. That includes spending time with our elders and learning those lessons through storytelling, which many times are tied to our creation stories or our prophecy stories, and how we need to carry ourselves as young and youth and preceding generations, that's how we share information, through storytelling, through oral histories, lived experiences, ontologies, epistemologies. So those are all important sets of tools that us as Indigenous peoples learn from and teach to. Centering that in the research in the realm within environmental studies is part of the work that I do. So having this hybrid of environmental studies and science, but also centering the social and cultural aspects of the work is the goal and what I've been working on for the past few years. And there's this term that we use, culture fire, which I don't know why I put it on the fourth slide, but I'll define that in a little bit what culture fire is. But to reference it more for how our cultural practitioners reference it, they call it good fire. So we have the catastrophic, devastating wildfire that's hard to manage just because of the intensity and frequency. But we're getting back to trying to put good fire back to the ground. So more smaller scale, sometimes people call them cold burns, things that are manageable and if done intermittently can push back against the occurrence and severity and intensity of wildfire. So the cultural practitioners that I work with, they call it good fire. And some of the words that I have highlighted address the meaningfulness of culture fire. So I just talked about how federal removal policy was coincided with current fire policy. And the more stories that I receive, especially here in California, I hear about how it was illegal to conduct a cultural burn or a burn that you're putting on the ground to try to bring back food systems or culturally significant plants. It was illegal. You were either shot or arrested for conducting a cultural burn. And so one of the practitioners that I work with now, Dr. Frank Lake, who's Karuk, and he's also a forester, he works in the northern tip of California, and he says it's an act of using, the act of using fire promotes individual and group identity and as political sovereignty. So it's a political act to conduct burns because some of these policies still, you need a lot of permissions and you need to be in touch with government agencies to be able to hold burns on your own ancestral lands. And so the way that he frames it is that it's a political act of resistance, and it's also, a way to honor and a way to amplify those Indigenous knowledge systems that are still here and are still vibrant. And then, so part of the social cultural healing work that I do is having these cultural burn demonstrations not only benefit the ecology system, right, in a scientific way, but it also helps bring together Indigenous peoples to learn from one another, have intergenerational conversations and lessons that are passed. So getting back in touch with our cultural ways that were here for millennia prior to colonization. And so that healingness interpersonally, like one-on-one healing, but then also as a community, like I've been a part of this and witnessed this and have experienced it myself. And so we're not just healing the land, right, through ecological services and systems, we're also healing ourselves and each other, getting back to our cultural knowledges and root systems, and sharing that amongst each other. Right? It's incredibly powerful. And the last thing I'll reference with the importance of the social and cultural work on top of the ecological work is a paper written by Kyle White. And so he talks a lot about an ecological tipping point, but he says the relationships that we've had with each other and our more than human kin, right, our plant and animal ancestors and relatives, right? So we had always stewarded ourselves and our lands with these concepts of reciprocity, trust, consent, and accountability. And he says we're beyond like an ecological tipping point because we first need to go back to how we harness and honor these relationships based on these pillars with our more than human relatives. And I think that's just so key with any kind of environmental work that folks are engaging in, to have these conversations that are centered in what we've always known to be important as Indigenous peoples and how we go about conducting ourselves with those relationships. Okay, so real quickly, I'll just go over some of the benefits of fire having small scale controlled burns. So the literature tells us that it reduces pests through the smoke, right? It helps get rid of problematic species that could be working their way through the trees or the plants, or even if the animals. So it reduces pests, it improves plant health. As I said earlier, many of our vegetation and plant species are fire dependent. So they need that fire to be able to germinate themselves and to be able to grow tall and strong. Recycles nutrients. So once the burn happens, it changes the chemical composition of the multi-layer of the soil. So it recycles back into the ground to be able to provide increased nutrients to plants that are coming up for the next growing season. Creates forage for animals. And something else that I've learned that's interesting about animals, one of the practitioners was telling us that the ash from the fire, some of the deer species will go out there and roll around in it as a way to get rid of like ticks or pests that are in their fur. I thought that was so cool. I learned that this year. So lots of good for animals post burn as well. Reduces the fuel load. So one of the problems, of course, here in California that's linked to wildfires, having that fuel build up because of no burn policies. You have it accumulating year after year after year. And so that serves as a perfect source for beginning the start of a wildfire. So cutting back on that and having more intermittent burns will be able to reduce that leaf litter pile that's been accumulating over the seasons. And then there's literature that suggests small scale cultural burns or prescribed burns helps regulate the water table. So it helps with the water temperatures that are increasing due to climate change. So it helps regulate that once it has the post-burn effects that enter the water. So good things about cultural burn or prescribed burns. And so very quickly, I'll just, I think I've discussed a little bit about my research. And so it's at the intersection of environmental policy. So we're working with CAL FIRE, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the Forest Service to be able to learn the regulatory frameworks to have our cultural practitioners be able to burn on their terms. So maybe not needing so many permissions to be able to hold the cultural burn demonstrations, and or working with state agencies to be able to hold those cultural burn demonstrations on their time and when they say seasonally it's appropriate to do so. Also working with ecology and environmental science. So I'm super interested in plant response and soil response to cultural burn demonstrations, in particular with our culturally significant plants that people use for food, fiber, medicine, and watercraft. Centering all of that through Native American studies pedagogy. So really honing in on how we're receiving these knowledges. I don't want to just collect plant data, collect soil data, have numbers, have that quantitative type of approach. I also want to spend time with our communities and the relationships that I've already formed and finding out what's important to them, what they want to see, how a restoration project is going to help them with their social cultural healing or social cultural aspects of ecology work. Ecological work. And so that's the goal in engaging in methodologies such as storytelling, oral histories, lived experiences, memory recall. So those will be the primary methodologies that I'll use. I don't like to call methodologies, it's just spending time with elders, spending time with community members to learn all that I can and all that they're willing to share about cultural fire and why it's important. Okay, so we work mainly with, so the work that I do at UC Davis, it's centered on one of the classes that we offer in the Native American Studies department. It's called Keepers of the Flame, Indigenous Cultural Fire in California. And the conversations that I've had with the folks that I work with, they're starting to engage in climate adaptation. And a few of them are making cultural burns part of their climate adaptation, their climate adaptation manuals or documents, how they're planning to strategize mitigating their environment and their community in the face of climate change. So the three main practitioners that we work with through the class are, to the right, the Honorable Chairman Ron Good. He is chairman of the North Fork Mono Tribe, and he's located at the nearby in Mariposa, nearby Yosemite National Park. And then the second practitioner that we engage with is Don Hankins, and Don is Miwok, and he actually runs the Big Chico Creek Reserve at Chico State University, which is about 2 hours south of where Davis is. And then my primary partners, my research collaborators, are Indigenous women at what we call the Tending and Gathering Garden. And so that garden is situated on Putwin Southern Windtune homelands, as is the University of California, Davis. And it's a partnership with the Cache Creek Nature Preserve. And so it's public lands. They use it for public education, but part of the lands are set aside for the reclamation and restoration of California Indian native plants. And so this is Diana Almendiras. She's Putwin and Nisenan. And I hold a lot of conversations with her about cultural fire and the meaningfulness and how we're bringing fire back to this particular place and space. And that's in Woodland, California. So just some pictures. One of the more powerful things that I've witnessed in the class is having our Native students that are here at UC Davis take our class and be able to learn directly from our cultural practitioners and learn things about them and their cultural identity that either they didn't share with me or they may not have had in the first place. So seeing their evolution of the powerfulness that comes with reconnecting with ancestral knowledge or intergenerational knowledge and working with elders, their faces just light up and they are so excited to engage in these burn demonstrations and come back week after week and year after year. So it's been an incredibly rewarding experience, like as an instructor and as a teacher, but also as a young Native woman and looking and seeing other young Native women that are taking advantage of these opportunities and being proud of who they are as Indigenous women situated far from home and trying to get through university systems. That's been incredibly powerful. The center picture is Diana Almendiras. She typically lights our first fire when we have these burn demonstrations. Then I have two students on either side of her, two Native women students on either side of her in our class. And the bottom picture left is with Chairman Ron Good. This was this past burn at Mariposa, where we still burned. We physically distanced ourselves and complied with safety regulations, but as we know, as Indigenous peoples who have survived pandemics and have survived climate change, the work must continue. So we must fulfill our land stewardship roles, and we did just that at Mariposa, California. And some of the feedback that we've gotten from our students in taking the class, just an entire shift of how they think about fire and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous land stewardship ethics. So these are from both Native and non-Native students. These are their reflections. And I have to say that we have had students that had been victims of wildfire in California. It's taken their family homes, it's displaced them. So they came into the class, some of them have come into the class with apprehension because they have that lived experience of wildfire, and then seeing the evolution of how they've developed a more interpersonal relationship with fire, and that it's a good tool to have, and it's a spirit of its own that working with and honoring for, can help us ecologically, socially, and culturally. So again, it's been a powerful experience as an educator to be able to see that that shift in perspective when students come into the class, maybe not knowing too much about cultural fire, Indigenous peoples, land stewardship ethics, and then have them leave knowing and learning this, and then passing it on to mom and dad or brother and sister, roommates, classmate. It's an incredibly powerful tool that we have with the class and the students that take it. Some of our community outcomes with our, we call them fire workshops. So the demonstrations that we held, agencies were invited, community members were invited, and other tribes, other nations in surrounding areas. They all came out to this Indigenous fire workshop, which was last year. We couldn't invite too many people out this year. So we mainly focused just on the students and the practitioners. But last year we had a really great turnout with those folks identified at the demos. And part of the outcomes were having people get together and learn one another about cultural fire and cultural burns, and having a Native Plant Restoration Day. And here we built relationships with CAL FIRE, Air Quality, Forest Service, EPA, everybody that's involved in writing a burn plan, forming those relationships in a good way and being able to harness that power back to our practitioners makes it easier to navigate California federal, state policies, fire policies. Also creating a Patwin language plant guide. And so one of the things that makes me excited about working with plants is learning. I always didn't like learning the scientific names of plants, one, because it's difficult and challenging, but also because as an Indigenous person, I knew there were native names that describe not only what they look like, what they tasted like, where they were located, how their importance, right? So there are all ways that our ancestors named things. So I always didn't like using scientific names, Latin names, to describe plants when I knew they had their own names that they responded to, right? Plants respond to. And so part of this work is returning those Patwin names to those scientific names of the plants and creating a language guide for the community members here. So it's not just about the university work, it's about what can we have that's a deliverable, or what could be a useful tool for the communities that we're working with. So this revitalizes language through identification of foods, fibers, and medicines. And then in addition, we also have basketry, tending, and harvest events. And so the thing that differentiates a controlled burn or a prescribed burn from a cultural burn, one of the reasons that they're different is cultural burns, the goals of the burn could be different. So the goal of prescribed burns or controlled burns are acreages burned. That tends to be the blanket goal of engaging in prescribed burns or cultural burns, prescribed burns or controlled burns, excuse me. But with cultural burns, the goal is usually a specific plant species or a specific area that we need to put fire to in order to have it grow back better, stronger next year. And so for my three practitioners, their common goal with cultural burns is to put fire to plants that they need for basketry materials. So I'm Apache, right? I'm Inde, so I'm a different tribe than the tribes that I work with. But the things that make us similar and similarities, I call them similar storyscapes, right? Because I'm not in my home territory right now, but the thing that draws me to the work that California natives, or natives in what we now call California, baskets are incredibly meaningful, right? And I think that's fair to say for a lot of our tribes, basketry materials carried and were a utilitarian tool to carry our medicines and our foods, and more importantly, our babies. So all tribes, well, not all tribes, excuse me, many tribes make baby baskets or cradle boards that hold our lives, right? Our livelihoods. And so the goal of cultural burns with the practitioners that I work with are to build basketry materials that are of good quality. So bringing back those good quality basketry materials that they always haven't been able to harvest because of either no burn policies, and those plants don't go strong enough to make baskets, or over dependence on chemical and pesticide use in some public land areas, right? We don't want to collect items that have been sprayed so vigorously to hold our foods, let alone to hold our children. And so this has been something that practitioners have been working on for years. And now that those plants are reestablished in areas that don't have as much exposure to those things, we're working on gathering and setting the stage for more burns to be able to have high quality basketry materials. So we have basketry collection days where we have students go out and help our practitioners harvest materials that they'll eventually turn into baskets. So it's been interesting. I have practitioners that have been working on the reclamation of cultural burns for the past 20 plus years. So myself, I've been a part of these cultural burn demonstrations at UC Davis for the past 3 years. But as a conversation, I would say it's been building momentum for the past 5 to 10, right? So on a time scale, we can say that this is a relatively newer conversation, that to agency folks, to Indigenous folks, we've always had these conversations and we've always had these observations that lead us to believe we need to bring fire back. It's these policies that hold us back from doing so. So the momentum that's building right now in California, given the devastation that we've been experiencing, which I opened the talk with, in response to that, there's been some momentum and some movement that includes cultural fire and cultural practitioners. So there's emerging state policies. The California Wildlife and Forest Resiliency Action Plan now recognizes tribes as partners. So being able to create burn plans or put together demonstration plans without as much jurisdiction to thread through. So there's now power in that with California Wildfire and Forest Resiliency Action Plans. A new act of biodiversity was published to recognize the importance of cultural burning specifically in California. So part of the work that our practitioners have done with climate resiliency, climate action, climate mitigation plans. So this has been the fruits of that labor. So now Indigenous cultural burning is recognized by the state, therein giving more power to practitioners to be able to burn on their terms. Other momentums are tribal fire leadership. So I was looking in y'all state in Oklahoma to see what kind of burn networks are available. And it's interesting that they're, and I might be misspeaking here, but it almost seems easier to burn and have a prescribed burn plan be successful in Oklahoma in the Midwest than it is here in California. Just the jurisdictionally and the policy that's embedded within California makes it interesting to try to hold more burn demonstrations. But nonetheless, burn networks that are forming out here in California. So there's Cultural Fire Management Council, and then California tribes are leading the way in what they're calling training exchanges. So cultural burn demonstrations where they invite government actors, policymakers to the burn demonstrations to be able to learn how and why cultural fire is different and why it's needed back on the ground. So returning that good fire. And then university partnerships. I would argue that UC Davis is at the forefront in supporting the work of our cultural fire practitioners throughout the state of California. We have the Keepers of the Flame course, and that's actually funded through the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center that's housed at the Boulder, Colorado University Center for Atmospheric Research. So there's funding involved to be able to hold these cultural burn demonstrations. Of course, much more is needed, but at least UC Davis has been at the forefront in connecting cultural practitioners with university resources to put more fire to the ground. Okay, and just some references for folks interested in cultural fire and maybe getting something started in y'all state. That's always a question that I get when I give these presentations is how can we do this in my state? How could I reach out to the tribes here or community members? And so those conversations all start with elders, right, with our community elders. And I would venture to say that many of our tribes have used prescribed fire or cultural fire to sustain ourselves and our plant relatives. So we have that close connectedness, interpersonal and communal relationship with fire that we've held for millennia. And so, I would say that your area tribes, the peoples whose ancestral lands we're on would be the first contact in engaging in those conversations about fire, how we can use it as an ecological tool, and how it has a possibility of restoring our cultural and social aspects of our communities as well. So these would be some great resources to start with. And I did want to leave some questions. Oh yeah. Oh, good. Thank you, Tribal Studies. So I did want to thank you, Sean. Thank you for allowing me time and space. My email address is listed there, mmadams@ucdavis.edu. And then I also have a blurb on the Native American Studies webpage. It talks about the different research projects that I'm a part of, different community members that I work with, and just my work overall. Support it. If you're interested in learning more, I would love to connect and send emails. So with that, thank you.
And with that, thank you, Melinda. We really appreciate your time. I do have a couple questions here. The first question we got is, what recommendations do you have for families who wish to advocate for a more Indigenous-centered understanding in the care of their respective patient?
That's a good question. So if I'm understanding correctly, they're asking for if they have families or community members that want to be more indigenous knowledge based or centered.
Question. Yes, yeah. How can we like center ourselves? It can be really difficult with Western, these things are so present, and it's like, how can we center ourselves more around those indigenous knowledge systems?
Yeah. So the way that our cultural burns work is that we are very community faced. And so much of this work is done in consultation and collaboration with the indigenous nations tribes that we work with. And so we invite community members out to the burn demonstrations. The university sometimes calls it service learning, and I'm in the department that doesn't like that term, right? Because those are obligations. That's
right,
rent,
right.
right? You're paying rent on native land. That's not a service. But I would say universities, they're engaging in community-based participatory research, and they have these service learning opportunities. And so I would first and foremost, because y'all have the Center for Tribal Studies, I would engage in those type of organizations that are either Native led or have Native consultation attached to their vision and mission, right? So I would start there to be able to connect with folks that might have similar interests and that might already have, community learning opportunities. Right, because we can't be in these spaces of academia without including our community members, because that's a privilege, and that's part of who we are as Indigenous peoples and giving back and honoring our communities. And so I would say within the university system to reach out to like a Native center or the Center for Tribal Studies or somewhere that works by and for Native studies, Native students and community members. That would be my first start. And then just finding overlaying interests for you and your family, finding family friendly things, those would be my recommendations. And in holding the university accountable to making education available for community members too.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. We got one more question. What are the main barriers to conducting statewide cultural fire in California?
Oh, it's a good question. And I think I always try to gauge what people's questions are going to be. So the barriers to cultural burns in California specifically, and these might be prevalent in other states as well. So public perceptions, it's still an ongoing struggle, even here in California, with educating folks in that small scale intermittent burns can help us from experiencing catastrophic wildfire, during the summer seasons. And so educating folks on the goodness of fire and the benefits of small scale burns, it's still an ongoing educational process that everybody that works in prescribed burns, cultural burns, controlled burns, that we engage with all the time. And a lot of that has to do with the Smokey the Bear campaign, right? And how only you can prevent forest fires, no fire, that no burn policy that was upheld by colonialism, right? Settlerism, unpacking that, disentangling that. It's still a big part of the work that we do, unfortunately. So yeah, public perception, that's a big one with the work that we do. Resources, so it costs money to have these cultural burn demonstrations, to pay people, to pay for the water that has to be out there, to pay for the equipment that we need to be able to successfully conduct burns. So having enough money, the state doesn't allocate enough to have those feet on the ground to be pushing back against large scale wildfire. So we don't have the resources that we need right now to hold more small scale intermittent burns. And then policy, broken treaties situated public land, tribal lands on public lands. And so having tribes be on their own ancestral homelands, but still having to comply with federal policy, it gets complicated, as we all know. Recognized, unrecognized, treaty rights, allotted lands, right? Those are all land complications that are furthered when we want to talk about natural resources or putting fire back to the ground. So I would say these are the three main barriers in California specifically, but could be the barriers that people experience throughout what we call the United States too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. A big wadong from all of us over here. We know we'll be looking out for your name in the news in the future, because you're doing some really important work, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share it with us.
Yeah, if I could just share one more, actually, I have a little bit of time. I'll just share a couple more things. So I did a little bit of work on what prescribed burn looks like in Oklahoma. And I was in on a conference a couple months ago, and a person from Oklahoma was talking to me about how they would get, prescribed burn going. And I pulled this up, and it's from 2015. I know it's dated, but I was at least elated a little bit because it did acknowledge that, Indigenous peoples in the Ozarks, they tended the lands in the areas of the Ozarks for millennia before colonization. So this is a Nature Conservancy, one of the groups that kind of advocates for more prescribed burn demonstrations. So they talked about a successful burn they had in 2015, and just the wonderful things that when managed correctly or tended to correctly has ecological benefits. But then it also had a paragraph acknowledging not the specific tribal nations or what we call ourselves, but it did say that natives had stewarded the land of the Ozarks for millennia. So I was excited to learn about that. Definitely more work that needs to be done in making those more specific and honoring them in a specific way, but at least that they did that. So I was kind of humbled and happy that they did that. And the last question that I tend to get, and just so I'm leaving here feeling good about it, is the difference between cultural burns and controlled burns. So that's always the number one question that I get, because state agencies always tell us, well, we do controlled burns, we do, prescribe burns, but we always have to interject and say, but this is different, and for many reasons. And so very quickly, the differences that I can at least define in holding these conversations with different practitioners is that the overarching goal is usually different. I think I said that earlier. So usually prescribed burns is acreages, how much can we burn in this amount of time, versus cultural burns, it's what species do we need to set good fire to have it thrive next year and the years that are coming. And I talked about the basketry materials earlier. That's the number one thing that the practitioners that I work with are centered on, is how can we bring back our red bud that they use for baby baskets, or how could we not bring back, but how could we have this species come back stronger and in more abundance. And then when we work with Chairman Ron Good, and where he works with willow and he works with manzanita, so those are all basketry materials that his people use for baby baskets. So the goal is different, right? One is acreages, and one is baby baskets, and those are very different scopes, right? And different meaningfulness, and what you hold special and what you hold, what you're trying to honor. Training certifications. So I do have fire training, like agency training, but I more so engage with cultural burns, which for many reasons they don't want to wear the yellows and the greens, right? What the woman in the picture here on the right is wearing, because that's, it's a political act to not wear it. They're like, I don't need a state agency to tell me like what I need to wear to burn. Like, my ancestors know this knowledge and how to be safe and how to go about conducting yourself responsibly. I don't have to have these certs, or I don't have to wear these yellows and greens, which I kind of like too. I'll be out there in a burn, and my mentors are telling me, put the yellows on, it's for safety. But then, some of the indigenous tribal members, they're like, we know how to do this. Like, this is ancestral knowledge embodied. So it's always interesting, the places that I go, like if they want to wear the yellows or the greens, right? It's like, a political statement. Training certifications, having a training certification, or making it so anybody in the community can participate. Those are interesting things that are tied to cultural burning. And then pre and post care. So the biggest difference, and my favorite piece of information that practitioners have shared with me, they say the difference between cultural fire and prescribed burns and controlled burns is agency folks with controlled burns, they put a burn plan together, they come over to our property or to our land, they burn, and then they go, right? But as cultural fire practitioners, the way that we hold our demonstrations is we plan for weeks in advance, and we go out and we form piles to know where we're going to conduct fire and ensure everybody's safety, and make sure we identify the break lines that's near water or away from houses or meaningfulness, things that are meaningful on the land. So we've done all that work before and we've prepped the land. Then you have the actual burn demonstration where we invite anybody and everybody in the community to come out and learn and burn with us, right? So there's a community aspect to it. It's not just certain people with certain certifications that participate. And then lastly, we have a cleanup day, right? We go over, we rake over, we get those chemical compositions that are left over, the ash back into the soil, and we replant culturally significant plants that we want to thrive. So it's a multi-tiered, obligatory process that's not just one and done. So that's the main difference that I love that practitioners share with me that differentiates controlled burn from what we're trying to do in reclaiming the cultural burns.
That's awesome. And I apologize for cutting you off earlier because the work you're doing really is important. And I really appreciate the cultural revitalization that's taking place and the work you're doing and bringing these practices back. It's going to be super important for the generations that are going to come after us. So thank you so much for joining us. And we hope we can catch you sometime in the future. All right. And then to everyone else here, I want to remind you to please take some time to complete the survey that's in the chat. The survey will help us to just improve our sessions in the future and make sure that the Symposium on the American Indian remains a cornerstone opportunity in Indian country. Thanks again, Melinda. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, I'm going to hop off here. Feel free to email me, anybody, Center for Tribal Studies as well. And I look forward to coming back next year.